Palestinian people are suffering in Gaza. These same efforts should also be focused on the aggressor and not the aggressed, that is, on the Israeli occupation and not on Palestinians or Lebanese or other states of the region which have been impacted by Israeli crimes of all kinds and sorts. And these countries have had enough of the authority and the arrogance of this Israeli occupation. We remain firmly convinced that a return to peace and security and stability in the Middle East will stem from the ability of this Council to overcome the obstacles it faces and to be able to impose full respect, comprehensive respect for Lebanon, its territorial integrity, its sovereignty, and it also depends on the capacity of this Council to implement the resolutions adopted to ensure a ceasefire in Gaza and to put an end to systematic Israeli escalation in the region, put an end to the occupation of Arab territories by Israel to create and to put an end to this crisis by ensuring a Palestinian state.
I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Sergei Vershinin, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation.
Thank you very much. Madam President, distinguished ministers, we support the convening by the Presidency of an emergency meeting in connection with the sudden escalation of developments in the friendly country of Lebanon and the Lebanon-Israeli border region. We thank the UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, for the briefing and for his assessment of the regional situation. Developments in recent days show that our worst forecasts are coming to pass. The escalation of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which resulted in a wave of instability throughout the entire Middle East, from the Red Sea to Iraq, and triggered a full-blown confrontation between Israel and Hezbollah, the main victims of which are civilians on both sides of the blue line. Since 23 September, the victims of the largest-scale Israeli bombardment since 2006 by Israel against Lebanon include at least 569 people, including 50 children. 1,835 people have been wounded, according to the Deputy UNICEF representative in Lebanon, Etty Higgins. In one day, more Lebanese died than in the last 11 months. And there are 2 UN OCHA staff members who perished. 500,000 people have had to flee their homes on 24 September after yet another Israeli airstrike in the Bekaa Valley. An entire family of 10 people died. On 20 September, more than 50 people were killed as a result of an Israeli airstrike on a densely populated residential area. Retaliatory strikes on military objects in Israel are being carried out by Hezbollah as well. All of this is being carried out literally several days after the horrific terrorist attack with the detonation of wireless devices in Lebanon, which claimed the lives of 39 people. Several thousand were wounded. We emphatically condemn the large-scale military attack and provocations against the friendly nation of Lebanon. We extend our sincere condolences to the families of the dead, and we wish a speedy recovery to the wounded. We categorically reject indiscriminate attacks whose victims are civilians. In West Jerusalem, statements are made that the objective of the military operation being carried out against Lebanon is to create safe conditions for the return of internally displaced persons to the north of the country. According to the Chief of General Staff of the IDF, Herzi Halevi, this is a preparation for a ground offensive. However, the experience of the 2006 Israeli campaign has already demonstrated that even superiority in terms of military equipment and weaponry does not result in peace and security exclusively through military methods. President, the developments in the region once again show that seeking complicated solutions to protracted crises, including the Lebanese crisis, is only possible through dialogue. There's a need to immediately end the unfolding spiral of violence before it spirals completely out of control. We call for an immediate cessation of hostilities, which would result for an end to the bloodletting and for conditions to be created for the restoration of the settlement process, bringing it back to a political diplomatic track. There's an important need to abandon reckless rhetoric. We'll recall the words of the Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant that Israelis could push Lebanon to the Stone Age, as well as threats of destruction for those who play with fire in the context of the resistance against Hezbollah. We believe that this atmosphere, which has reached a breaking point, under these circumstances, there's a need to exercise maximum restraint and to avoid provocations, which will further fuel the conflict. However, regardless of our concerns about Lebanon, we all perfectly understand that the way to halt the imminent, the looming war in the Middle East is possible only if there's an end to bloodletting in Gaza, where the number of the victims of the inhumane Israeli military campaign has already exceeded 42,000 people. Council in Action, which the Council de facto is a hostage of a permanent member, is all the more unacceptable given that the Council has a host of instruments at its disposal in order to compel the warring parties to peace. This would help to save the lives of Israeli hostages. The hopes of their return is evaporating with each day that the Israeli operation continues. We believe at the next stage there's a need for a critical stage is a fair solution to the Palestinian issue on the basis of the well-known international legal basis. There is no other way to resolve the Middle East crisis. Turning to Lebanon, we consistently believe that there's a need for full-fledged implementation of Security Council Resolution 1701, which clearly stipulates Israel's obligation to cease all offensive military operations, to withdraw its troops from South Lebanon, to end the occupation of Lebanese lands, as well as provisions for the withdrawal of all Hezbollah formations to the north of the Litani River. We also fully support UNIFIL, which plays a key stabilizing role along the Blue Line. It is the presence of the peacekeepers that had for a long time helped to mitigate risks of the beginning of a full-blown military confrontation. We support and we stress the need for strict compliance with Resolution 1701 and respect for the safety and security of blue helmets. For our part, we will continue to focus our diplomatic efforts on de-escalating the situation, preventing a catastrophic scenario. We stand ready to coordinate with international and regional partners to that end. Most importantly, there's a need for nobody to continue to monopolize these efforts for the advancement of their geopolitical agendas. For essentially, we have to counter the consequences of specifically those actions being carried out by one of the permanent members of the Security Council. Thank you for your attention.
Mr. Vershinin for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Ando Toshishide, Assistant Minister and Director General, Middle Eastern and African Affairs Bureau, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank the Secretary General for his briefing. Japan is gravely concerned about the deteriorating situation in the Middle East. Over the past year, the Security Council members, including Japan, have been calling on all concerned actors to refrain from any action that would further escalate tensions in the region. Yet heavy exchanges of fire between Israel and Hezbollah in the past few days have reportedly killed hundreds of people, including women and children, and wounded thousands. Japan extends its heartfelt condolences to the bereaved family members and loved ones of the victims and expresses its deepest sympathy to those who were injured. Japan renews its call for de-escalation by all relevant parties. Madam President, no one desires to witness any further catastrophe in the Middle East. Japan is especially concerned with the civilians who have been victimized and affected by the ongoing conflict. Many innocent civilians, including women and children, have been killed and injured by attacks. Tens of thousands of people in both Lebanon and Israel have been displaced from their homes since the daily exchange of fire began last October. We once again urge all the parties to immediately take all measures to prevent civilian casualties and adhere to international law, including the protection of civilians. Japan calls for the full implementation of relevant UN Security Council resolutions, including Resolution 1701, which calls for a return to cessation of hostilities along the Blue Line, as well as abiding by international law, including international humanitarian law. At the same time, Japan strongly urges all parties to exercise the utmost restraint to avoid further escalation. Japan supports the tireless efforts made by UNIFIL together with UNTSO and UNSCOL to reduce tensions. Japan also reiterates its strong support for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and the release of the hostages based on the outlines of Security Council Resolution 2735. We reaffirm our strong commitment to making every diplomatic effort to end the cycle of violence and restore peace and stability in the Middle East. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Ando for his statement. I give the floor now to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his important briefing on a tragically escalating situation. I acknowledge the participation of His Excellency, President of the Council of Ministers of Lebanon. Following the indiscriminate explosion of communication devices in Lebanon a few days ago, reportedly killing 37 people and injuring at least 2,931, the UN Secretary General and most Council members expressed deep concerns about the dramatic escalation of tit-for-tat attacks and the build-up to large-scale aerial attacks. Over the last 2 days, it has been reported that Israel carried out about 800 attacks on about 1,600 Hezbollah targets in southern Beirut, East Bekaa Valley, and other areas of South Lebanon. Hezbollah also has claimed to have launched more than 300 rockets against military bases in Haifa and other areas deep in northern Israel. This dangerous escalation of the situation has resulted in the death of at least 579 people, including 50 children and 94 women, with about 1,500 more injured and 16,500 people displaced. It is also reported that Hezbollah rockets and missiles fired into northern Israel caused damage to civilian areas and injured few people. Sierra Leone expresses grave concern for the safety of civilians and cautions the parties to the conflict that the deliberate targeting of civilians and essential civilian infrastructure is a clear violation of international humanitarian law. We therefore urge the parties to the conflict to desist from their indiscriminate bombing of communities and to protect civilians. Sierra Leone calls for both parties to the conflict to exercise maximum restraint, and we further stress the urgent need for immediate de-escalation. We remain concerned over the impact of missile strikes on UNIFIL positions and injury to peacekeepers. We condemn all acts that endanger the lives of peacekeepers. We urge all parties to ensure the safety and security of United Nations personnel and to respect the inviolability of UN premises. Madam President, as we take note with concern the dangerous rhetoric relating to the achievement of respective military or political objectives by the conflicting parties, we reiterate that military action is not a solution for achieving their stated objectives. Sierra Leone therefore calls on the parties to use diplomatic channels, include the United Nations good offices, to avoid further escalation and the risk of an all-out war or wider destabilizing regional conflagration. As the region grapples with the war in Gaza and the dire humanitarian crisis, we reject actions that may jeopardize the ongoing peace negotiations between Israel and Hamas and threaten regional and global peace and security. We call on all countries in the region and elsewhere with influence to prevail upon both parties to desist from further attacks over the Blue Line and elsewhere. Escalation of attacks or an all-out war is in no one's interest. The impact of a full-blown conflict on the Lebanese people and economy will be completely devastating. As we noted previously already in this Council, the people of Lebanon have already gone through a lengthy and destructive war and periods of fragility. This Council must do all it can to prevent a reoccurrence. We must heed the call made by the Secretary General and the world leaders at the United Nations General Assembly 79th Session General Debate to prevent this conflict from escalating. Madam President, the potential humanitarian devastation of Lebanon is already becoming apparent. The director of Save the Children Lebanon reports that children in Lebanon, especially those from the south, who have been living with cross-border violence between Israel and Hezbollah for the past years, are, and I quote, terrified by the sound of drones and fighter jets over their heads and feel as though they can never be safe again, end of quote. UNICEF officials in Lebanon have also noted that more children died this past Monday than throughout the entire past year. Schools and universities across the country have been shut down and have already been used as temporary shelters. We welcome effort by the resident and humanitarian coordinator for Lebanon, who has already met with the Lebanese government officials, including the Prime Minister and Minister of Environment and other UN humanitarian agencies, in planning a coordinated aid response, including the activation of an emergency operations center and identification of schools to be designated as shelters. We urge for timely provision of the $50 million United States dollars that humanitarian agencies have requested to pre-position basic needs, such as food and shelter supplies, for an immediate response for the next few weeks. In conclusion, Madam President, Sierra Leone continues to call for the parties to consider the regional implications of their actions and to recommit to a cessation of hostilities. At this juncture, the priorities for the Security Council and the regional stakeholders should be implementation of a permanent ceasefire in Lebanon and Gaza, the release of hostages and prisoners, facilitation of access to humanitarian aid, and the commencement of the implementation of a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for your briefing. Colleagues, in the days since we last convened to discuss the situation along Israel and Lebanon's shared border, the United States has engaged intensively with all parties in the region. Our aim is clear: to avert a broader war that we believe is in no party's interest, not the people of Israel and not the people of Lebanon. As President Biden emphasized to the General Assembly, a diplomatic solution consistent with UN Security Council Resolution 1701 remains the only path to durably reverse the cycle of escalation and to enable displaced people in both Israel and Lebanon to return to their homes. Undergirding U.S. efforts is a recognition that diplomacy will only become more difficult amid a further escalation of this conflict. We are gravely concerned by reports that hundreds of Lebanese civilians have died in recent days. We further mourn the deaths of 2 UNHCR staff. At the same time, and as we have repeatedly made clear, the Security Council cannot ignore the origins of this particular conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. Hundreds of thousands of Lebanese civilians and more than 65,000 Israeli civilians have been displaced as a result of Hezbollah's decision on October 8 to break the peace that had largely endured along the Blue Line following the Council's adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 1701 in 2006. Hezbollah's buildup of weapons, many of which are supplied by Iran, and its presence along the Blue Line, in defiance of Resolutions 1559 and 1701, has long been a source of instability. Nobody wants to see a repeat of the full-blown war that occurred in 2006. But the path to enduring stability goes beyond ending cross-blue line strikes It must end with a comprehensive understanding relating to the Blue Line that has real implementation mechanisms. As we learned in 2006, diplomacy is most effective when the international community unites with a shared goal and speaks with one voice. We are working with other countries on a proposal that we hope will lead to calm and enable discussions to a diplomatic solution. We encourage the Security Council to lend its support for these diplomatic efforts in the coming days. Colleagues, even as we work to avert a broader war, we have been clear that Israel has the right to defend itself against Hezbollah's attacks, to include the escalatory ballistic missile launch that targeted Tel Aviv last night, in addition to the rockets fired every day since October 8. No member of this Council would tolerate a terrorist group conducting rocket and ballistic missile attacks on its territory. And all parties must comply with international humanitarian law and take all reasonable steps to minimize harm to civilians, especially those in densely populated areas. The United States also underscores its strong support for UNIFIL and emphasizes the importance of all parties ensuring that UNIFIL personnel are safe and secure. In this dangerous moment, it is imperative that we work together to help Lebanon's people and the region avoid further tragedy. The United States will continue to do our part and appreciates the efforts of other nations who share our commitment to forging a diplomatic solution. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. The devastating communication device attacks last week were shocking. But the Israeli airstrike across Lebanon since Monday are even more staggering and distressing. On September 23rd alone, more than 500 people were killed, marking Lebanon's highest death toll since the long civil war and equaling half the total death during the bloody 2006 conflict. I would now like to highlight the following points. First, protecting civilians is not an option. It's an obligation and the cornerstone of IHL. While it is claimed that the attacks targeted military objects, the bombing across Lebanon have devastated civilian and medical infrastructure, causing widespread casualties, displacement, and panic in all Lebanese communities. Simultaneously, thousands of Israelis have been forced into bomb shelters due to Hezbollah's rocket attacks that have expanded in frequency, intensity, and range. Neither can be justified. My delegation is also deeply saddened by the death of 2 UNHCR employees during Monday's Israeli airstrikes. International humanitarian law clearly provides for the duty of all parties to ensure the protection of humanitarian workers at all times. This is also an obligation. Second, we urgently call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint, prioritize de-escalation, and elevate common efforts to avoid an all-out war in the region. From the Blue Line to Gaza, the West Bank, Yemen, and Syria, the region is at serious risk of descending into a broader and more destructive war. History has shown that declarations like escalate to de-escalate rarely achieve peace. We therefore condemn any inflammatory rhetoric advocating mass destruction, the potential reoccupation, or even new settlements in southern Lebanese territory. Such words undermine peace and put millions of Lebanese and Israelis in peril of even greater violence. Diplomacy is the only viable path to sustainable peace, and such statements must stop. We also condemn all hostilities surrounding the blue line, which have significantly increased since last weekend. We are deeply concerned about their ongoing impact on the safety and operations of UNIFIL, in which the Republic of Korea is actively participating. And we reiterate that the security of UN peacekeepers must be ensured. We call on parties to cease all attacks against Israel and respect the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and political independence of Lebanon within its recognized borders. Madam President, we stand at the edge of an abyss, but it is not too late to step back. Urgent diplomacy, de-escalation, a ceasefire in Gaza, and the implementation of relevant Security Council resolutions, including Resolution 1701, are the only viable path forward. Thank you.
The representative of the Republic of Korea for the statement. I give the floor now to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, Madam President. The situation in Lebanon is quickly approaching a dangerous and devastating tipping point. As noted by the Secretary General, the country is on the brink. Time is running out for us to protect the millions of lives that will be impacted across the Middle East and beyond if this situation continues to deteriorate. Since the atrocities committed by Hamas and other terrorist groups on Israel on October 7th, we have witnessed over 11 months of near daily exchanges of fire across the Blue Line, further exacerbating an already highly volatile context. On 17 and 18 September, widespread simultaneous explosions across Lebanon killed dozens and injured thousands. The consequences of such a widespread attack, including the large number of civilian casualties, were foreseeable. Such actions also reflect a worrying disregard for established norms in IHL. Over recent days, we have witnessed Israeli airstrikes across Lebanon. The scale and intensity of these attacks has resulted in the deaths of over 550 people, including women and children, and over 1,800 injured. They have damaged civilian infrastructure, severely impacted Lebanese health services, and caused major civilian displacement. Worryingly, we are again hearing echoes of the rhetoric similar to that used to justify the thousands of attacks on medical and UN facilities in Gaza since last October. As the Secretary General warned, we cannot let Lebanon be transformed into another Gaza. In Israel, rockets fired by the military wing of Hezbollah are landing on military bases, facilities, and residential areas. Schools have been closed across northern Israel, and hospitals in the country are being forced to move operations to protect medical center areas. These actions must be condemned. President, Malta's position is clear. We call on all parties to protect civilians in line with their obligations under international humanitarian law. Any attack which targets civilians or civilian infrastructure is unacceptable and must immediately cease. We express grave concern for the safety of civilians on both sides of the Blue Line. Civilians on both sides wish for nothing more than to live in peace and no longer have to fear for their lives and those of their loved ones. We strongly condemn the continued loss of lives, including the killing of 2 UNHCR workers this week, and mass displacement events. The ongoing and critical work of the UN and its partners must be supported. This includes OSHA's work in seeking to ensure the safety of UN and humanitarian personnel and the continued bravery of Lebanese humanitarian workers. President, we echo the call for urgent de-escalation. It continues to be the civilian population that suffers the most in a full-blown war. This outcome, which we can all foresee, must be averted at all costs, including by renewed diplomatic efforts. The Security Council has a crucial role to play in forging a path forward, one that prioritizes de-escalation and restraint across the region. Security Council resolutions must be respected and implemented. Along the blue line, all parties must step back from the abyss and implement an immediate cessation of hostilities and a ceasefire based on Resolution 1701. UNIFIL and the Lebanese armed forces are essential cornerstones of any future security architecture in the region and should be bolstered to the largest possible extent. Malta is a proud troop-contributing country to UNIFIL. Israeli airstrikes and overflights across Lebanon must stop. We also strongly denounce the possession of weapons outside the control of the Lebanese state by militant groups, including the military wing of Hezbollah. In this vein, we stress the need to establish an area free of armed weapons, other than those of the government of Lebanon and of UNIFIL, between the Blue Line and the Litani River. Across the broader region, the Israel-Hamas conflict in Gaza continues to risk spiraling into a wider conflict. As the Secretary-General outlined yesterday, this conflict threatens to take the entire region with it. In this vein, we reiterate our call for an immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, the safe return of hostages to Israel, and the full implementation of all Security Council resolutions, namely 2712, 2720, and 2735. In conclusion, President, the continued suffering of ordinary civilians makes our role, our responsibilities crystal clear. The risk of military escalation with catastrophic consequences for the entire region requires decisive action by a united Council. All of us here around this table and beyond must do our utmost to avert the all-out war that appears to already be on our doorstep. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci Madame la Présidente et nous remercions la France d'avoir demandé cette réunion d'urgence ainsi que le secrétaire général pour son intervention détaillant les événements de ces derniers jours. Et comme le secrétaire général venait de le dire, lundi a été la journée la plus meurtrière depuis la fin de la guerre civile au Liban. Plus de 560 personnes, dont une cinquantaine d'enfants, ont été tuées et depuis lors la situation ne s'est pas améliorée. L'escalade régionale tant redoutée est en train de se dérouler devant nos yeux. À l'instar d'autres membres de ce Conseil, nous avions mis en garde contre ce risque et plaidé pour un appel fort et uni afin de prévenir cela. Nous avons la responsabilité de trouver les moyens pour éviter que la situation s'aggrave encore davantage. Les frappes aériennes massives d'Israël sur une grande partie du Liban et les roquettes indiscriminées tirées par le Hezbollah sur Israël sont inacceptables et doivent cesser. Nous condamnons le fait que, selon les informations du ministère de la Santé libanaise, ces frappes aient fait de nombreuses victimes civiles. Ce bilan tragique et les traumatismes causés à la population civile au Liban sont inadmissibles. Il en va de même pour les blessés, les dégâts et la peur constante que les tirs de roquettes génèrent parmi la population israélienne. Je présente nos condoléances très sincères à toutes les familles des victimes civiles de ce conflit. À ces souffrances s'ajoute l'angoisse de dizaines de milliers d'habitants du sud du Liban et de la Bekaa qui sont en train de fuir, ainsi que des personnes déplacées en Israël qui ne peuvent toujours pas rentrer chez elles. Une chose est absolument claire, le dialogue et la désescalade sont les seuls moyens pour mettre fin à ce conflit. La dynamique actuelle risque de mener à une guerre générale que toutes les parties disent vouloir éviter. Nous soutenons donc que tous les efforts pour arriver à une solution diplomatique. Toutes les parties doivent s'engager en vue de la mise en œuvre intégrale de la résolution 1701 qui est reconnue par tous. Ce Conseil a réaffirmé son soutien à cette demande à l'unanimité il y a un mois. La résolution dresse un chemin pour résoudre les causes sous-jacentes du conflit et permettre aux populations au Liban et en Israël de vivre en paix et en sécurité. La Suisse appelle donc Israël et le Hezbollah à cesser immédiatement les hostilités. Le droit international humanitaire doit être pleinement respecté par toutes les parties, notamment les principes de distinction, proportionnalité et précaution dans la conduite des hostilités, et ce en toutes circonstances. Prendre toutes les précautions possibles pour protéger les civils, y inclus le personnel humanitaire et médical, est une obligation en vertu du droit international humanitaire conventionnel et coutumier. Nous rappelons aussi que les attaques contre les civils et l'infrastructure civile indispensable peuvent constituer des crimes de guerre. La redevabilité doit être assurée. Nous sommes indignés par la mort de deux employés du Haut Commissariat pour les réfugiés des Nations Unies tués au Liban, au sud du Liban. Assurer la protection des travailleurs humanitaires ancrés dans le droit international humanitaire et rappelé dans la résolution 2730 de ce Conseil est central et un point que la Suisse a souligné lors d'une rencontre ministérielle cette semaine. La sécurité du personnel de la FINUL est également centrale. Cette force à laquelle la Suisse contribue par l'intermédiaire de l'ONUSC accomplit actuellement son travail dans un environnement extrêmement difficile. Nous saluons les efforts que la FINUL et l'UNSC continuent à livrer pour réduire les tensions et assurer la liaison entre les parties. Nous devons faire en sorte que ce conflit, comme celui à Gaza, où nous ne cesserons pas d'insister sur un cessez-le-feu, ainsi que sur la libération des otages et un accès humanitaire rapide et sans entrave, prenne fin immédiatement. Ce Conseil doit contribuer à une solution diplomatique de toute urgence et s'exprimer d'une voix unie pour éviter un embrasement régional que tous veulent éviter et dont la population civile paierait le prix fort. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his briefing on the urgent and rapidly deteriorating situation in Lebanon. I also welcome the participation of Prime Minister of Lebanon in today's meeting. President, this Council met only 6 days ago to discuss the recent attacks in Lebanon. Sadly, those deadly attacks using pagers and other communication devices pale in comparison to what occurred on Monday. Expressions of deep concern or alarm are wholly inadequate in capturing the true feeling of shock and devastation brought on by the reports that Israeli strikes killed more than 490 people, including 35 children, injured over 1,600 people in a single day. The death toll has since risen to over 560, including 50 children and 94 women. We note with deep concern that most of the airstrikes carried out by the Israeli Defense Forces on Monday were in the UNIFIL area of operations, and that 2 UNHCR staff members were among those killed. We extend our condolences to their families. At the same time, Hezbollah has claimed multiple strikes against military targets of the Israeli Defense Forces with rocket barrages, drones, and artillery in northern Israel and the occupied Syrian Golan. Mr. President, Lebanon has faced constant strikes across its territory over the last 11 months. However, these most recent events are reportedly the deadliest barrage since the 2006 war. The continued attacks by one country on the territory of another sovereign state, especially in light of their indiscriminate nature, cannot be allowed to occur with impunity. The protection of civilians cannot be treated as an afterthought to one nation's supposed security objectives. World leaders are gathered here at the United Nations in reaffirmation of their commitment to the United Nations Charter. Just this morning, we talked about leadership for peace, and on Monday, we adopted a pact for the future. On the very day that the future of 35 children was snuffed out in the most gruesome and inhumane way. The patterns emerging in Lebanon have become quite familiar, Mr. President. Our response cannot be more inaction. During yesterday's meeting on the war in Ukraine, most Council members called for an end to impunity and demanded that violators of international law be brought to justice. Mr. President, when the Council last met on this issue, Guyana described the situation in the Middle East as untenable. Now, I'm truly at a loss for words to describe the glaringly obvious disaster that awaits us. There will be no winner in any war in the Middle East. This much is fact. Yet, despite this reality, no party is willing to step back from the brink. Diplomatic efforts have not yet yielded significant results after almost 1 year. I call on those with influence to exert greater efforts. It is not too late to step back from the precipice. That process must begin with a ceasefire in Gaza and a recommitment to the full implementation of Resolution 1701. Guyana calls upon the parties to immediately cease the hostilities and to ensure that civilians are kept out of harm's way. Mr. President, the Lebanese people, much like the Palestinian people, have become innocent bystanders to the games of a handful of ideologues hell-bent on the achievement of their political pursuits. How much longer will we sit in this council only to express our concern and then gather in a few days later as circumstances inevitably worsen? The people of Lebanon are depending on us to act in this council. This council should consider the necessary action it can take to de-escalate the situation and ultimately end the war in Gaza. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias. Thank you. Mr. President, I'd like to thank Secretary General Antonio Gutierrez for the information he's provided on the disturbing situation in Lebanon. Less than a week ago, it's actually been less than a week since the Council met on this issue. The seriousness of the events and the possible spillover for the entire region warrant such a meeting. Since then, violence has been on the rise. Following the indiscriminate explosion of communication devices, there have been airstrikes by Israel in Beirut and other locations, and the indiscriminate launching of rockets from Lebanon into Israel by Hezbollah. These events are a violation of Resolution 1701, which calls for a definitive cessation of hostilities along the Blue Line. They are also a violation of Lebanon's sovereignty. Violence against the civilian population on both sides of the Blue Line may well cause even more displacements and become a new humanitarian crisis in the region. Once again, Ecuador recalls that the norms of international humanitarian law must be respected by all actors in the conflict at all times. Mr. President, in order to contain regional tensions, a ceasefire to end the war in Gaza is imperative. This will allow for the delivery of sufficient humanitarian aid to the region, as well as for the release of hostages held by Hamas for almost a year since the terrorist attacks on the 7th of October, which Ecuador condemns once again. Resolution 2735 must be implemented urgently. Those who want more violence must be given no excuses. We also need the commitment of countries in the region and international actors with influence over the parties to keep the Middle East from continuing with this spiral of violence, which is leading to destruction and deprivation. Regional organizations are also called on to act and to call for moderation and, above all, for restraint. Ecuador supports any initiative contributing to a de-escalation in the conflict, and we call on all leaders on all sides to act with responsibility and humanity. Mr. President, colleagues, the peaceful settlement of disputes is the very essence of multilateralism and a founding principle of the UN Charter. As we said this morning in the open debate on leadership for peace, The prevention of conflicts enshrined in the Charter and reaffirmed in the Pact for the Future adopted this week deserve the fullest attention. Only dialogue, building trust, and a two-state solution will make it possible to achieve the elusive but much desired peace in the Middle East. I wish to conclude, Mr. President, by echoing the appeal made by the Secretary General for the parties to observe maximum restraint, to prioritize the protection of the civilian population, and to guarantee the security of humanitarian workers and UNIFIL personnel. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank France for requesting this meeting and welcome the presence of Prime Minister Mikati of Lebanon. I also thank Secretary General Guterres for his briefing, which reminds us of the gravity of the current situation. The Lebanese people have just experienced the bloodiest week in decades. Thousands of communication devices were detonated simultaneously via remote control, causing heavy casualties of innocent civilians. China once again condemns such unscrupulous and indiscriminate attacks. While the Lebanese people were still reeling from the shock, bombs rained down from the sky. Israel launched multiple rounds of large-scale airstrikes on southern and eastern Lebanon, leading to over 500 deaths and close to 2,000 injuries. China is seriously concerned about the current situation between Lebanon and Israel, firmly supports Lebanon in defending its sovereignty, security, and national dignity, and strongly condemns acts that violate the basic norms governing international relations. We firmly oppose any indiscriminate attacks against civilians that breach the red line of international humanitarian law. We emphasize the importance of effectively guaranteeing the safety and security of UN peacekeepers. UN personnel and assets must not be the target of armed attacks. President, since the outbreak of the Gaza conflict last October, the international community has been focusing all its efforts on promoting an immediate ceasefire and preventing the conflict from spilling over and expanding. But the reality is heading toward the opposite direction. As world leaders are gathered here in New York, making an overwhelming call for the maintenance of peace in the Middle East in the GA General Debate, Israel has chosen to expand the fighting. This is nothing short of a mockery of international justice and the authority of international law. The Middle East cannot afford another war. It is imperative to stop military adventurism and to facilitate de-escalation. We welcome the appeal of Secretary General Guterres and the ongoing mediation efforts by the UN. We note that Lebanon has stated that it demands justice and a diplomatic solution. Foreign ministers of Egypt, Iraq, and Jordan issued a statement on the 25th, pointing out that deterioration will have serious consequences on the entire region. Other regional countries concerned have also stated that we want peace and seek no war. We urge Israel to make the right decision, put aside its obsession with the use of force, stop its military operations in Gaza, stop its violations of Lebanon's sovereignty and security, and stop adventurous acts which could drag the region into a new catastrophe. At the same time, we call on all relevant parties to exercise maximum restraint and to avoid escalating the situation. President, the Security Council bears the important responsibility of maintaining international peace and security. In the current situation, we understand that the vast majority of Council members support the Council in taking urgent action to prevent worsening of the situation. We hope that all Council members demonstrate political will and leadership for peace. respond to the expectations of Lebanon and Arab states, and support the Council in taking strong necessary actions without delay in order to play an effective role in stopping the war and easing the situation. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, I wish to thank the Slovenian presidency for convening this urgent meeting requested by France. We also thank the Secretary General for his insights on this very worrying matter. We welcome His Excellency the Prime Minister of Lebanon in this meeting. Mr. President, the situation in Lebanon continues to be a source of grave concern. The recent escalation between Hezbollah and Israel has resulted in near daily cross-border exchange of fire, causing a significant number of casualties and heightened regional tensions. Furthermore, Israel has intensified its military operations. Monday's bombardment was by far the largest it has launched against Lebanon since the last full-scale war raged between Israel and Hezbollah in the summer of 2006. Reports indicate that nearly 500 people have been killed, including children and employees of the United Nations Agency for Refugees, and over 1,600 are injured. This has led to widespread displacement, with many families fleeing their homes and seeking refuge in schools and other shelters. Just a few days ago, we met in this chamber, alarmed by the recent cyber attacks in Beirut and other parts of Lebanon, which resulted in hundreds of civilian victims, including children. Mr. President, the current events in Lebanon are inextricably linked to the ongoing deadly conflict in Gaza, which has claimed the lives of more than 41,000 Palestinians to date and showing no sign of abatement, raising the specter of further escalation. The humanitarian crisis is severe, and efforts to secure a ceasefire have so far been unsuccessful. We are deeply concerned about the potential of intensification of air raids in Lebanon in the coming days. It is in this connection that we reiterate our call on all parties to immediately cease all military operations on both sides of the Blue Line. We emphasize the critical need for de-escalation to prevent further instability, retaliatory actions, and bloodshed. We also reiterate the call on the parties to protect civilians, including humanitarian workers, in accordance with their obligations under international humanitarian law. We urge all parties involved to strictly adhere to international law and Security Council resolutions, particularly Security Council Resolution 1701, which called for, among others, a full cessation of hostilities, the withdrawal of Israeli forces from Lebanon, and the deployment of Lebanese and UNIFIL forces in southern Lebanon. In this regard, we urge those Council members with significant influence on both sides to work towards de-escalating the ongoing hostilities. We emphasize the need for urgent diplomatic efforts to prevent further escalation and address the humanitarian crisis. To conclude, Mr. President, Mozambique reiterates its firm commitment to the principles of the United Nations Charter and stands ready to support all efforts toward peaceful resolution of the conflicts in the Middle East. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. David Lammy, Secretary of State for Foreign Commonwealth and Development Affairs of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Mr. President, thank you, colleagues, for your contributions and thank you, Secretary General, for your briefing. And I want to acknowledge the presence of the Prime Minister of Lebanon in the chamber today. This is a moment of maximum danger. We're on the brink, the precipice, at a few minutes to midnight. We talk of the risk of full-scale regional war, but the truth is we are already witnessing conflict on multiple fronts. In Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, and the Red Sea. The strikes in recent days have taken 550 lives in Lebanon, the death of civilians, women and children. The UN workers killed. The Hezbollah rockets that have killed Israelis are just the latest in the cycle of pain, anguish and loss. Mr. President, as we face the abyss, this Council has a duty to speak with one voice, and we must say that the rockets must stop now. The airstrikes must stop now. Talks must start now, with an immediate ceasefire on both sides now. It is time to pull back from the brink. Mr. President, a full-blown war is not in the interests of the Israeli or the Lebanese people. And that is why, within hours of last week's strikes, I called for an immediate ceasefire between Lebanese, Hezbollah and Israel. Since then, we've worked closely with the United States and France to formalize a wider demand for the ceasefire and a political plan to implement it. And at the UN in New York, the Prime Minister and I have been urging our G7 and other partners to do the same. Our priority must be a political solution. In line with Resolution 1701, it is our duty to do all we can to exert maximum diplomatic pressure so Israeli and Lebanese civilians can return to their homes, so lives can be saved, so security can return to northern Israel and southern Lebanon, so that daily life can begin to return. Now, let me be clear. The United Kingdom condemns Hezbollah's attacks on Israel over the last 11 months, which have driven more than 60,000 people from their homes. There was no justification for these attacks. They have brought misery to ordinary people in Lebanon and Israel, and they have done nothing to end the conflict in Gaza or secure Palestinian statehood. And Iran, nothing justifies supplying weapons to terror groups in defiance of this Council. We call on Tehran to use its influence and urge Hezbollah to agree to a ceasefire. Mr. President, for the people of Israel and for the people of Lebanon, a brilliant, multicultural and tolerant nation taken captive by an armed militia that puts itself before the Lebanese people, we must come together to bring this conflict to an end. In 2006, this Council acted in the interests of peace and security. All parties need to embody that same spirit today. By coming together, act now to bring this conflict to an end, to stop the cycle of destruction, to stop the loss of yet more innocent lives, and to stop this conflict from exploding into full-blown war, and open a path to peace. That is what we need. Thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Lamy, for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Mohammad Najib Azmi Mikati, President of the Council of Ministers of Lebanon.
Mr. President, سيد الرئيس أود في البداية أن أعبر عن امتناني العميق للجمهورية الفرنسية على دعوتها لعقد هذه الجلسة المهمة في مجلس الأمن في ظل الأوضاع الصعبة التي يمر بها لبنان. لقد كانت فرنسا دائما صديقة وفية للبنان وشعبه، وقد وقفت إلى جانبنا في أصعب الظروف، وخير دليل على ذلك الجهد المخلص الذي تقوم به فرنسا اليوم بالتعاون مع الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية من أجل إصدار بيان مشترك مدعوم دوليا من أجل وضع نهاية لهذه الحرب القذرة. كما أشكر ستوفانيا رئيسة مجلس الأمن بهذا الشهر على تلبيتها لهذه الدعوة، وأشكر سعادة الأمين العام على الإحاطة التي قدمها في بداية هذه الجلسة. والشكر للجزائر الشقيقة ممثلة المجموعة العربية في مجلس الأمن على دعمها المستمر لنا، وأشكر جميع أعضاء هذا المجلس الكريم على دعمهم المستمر لسيادة لبنان ووحدته واستقراره. كما أنتهز المناسبة لأشكر جميع أعضاء هذا المجلس أيضا على دعمهم لقرار تمديد ولاية يونيفيل بناء لطلب لبنان. سيد الرئيس، نحن اليوم في لبنان نواجه انتهاكا واضحا لسيادة الدولة اللبنانية وحقوق الإنسان عبر الممارسات الوحشية للعدو الإسرائيلي بحق دولتنا وشعبنا اللبناني من خلال استباحة سيادته عبر إطلاق طائراته ومسيراته في سمائه، وقتل المدنيين فيه شبابا ونساء وأطفالا، وتدمير المنازل، وإرغام العائلات على النزوح في ظل ظروف إنسانية قاسية. هذا عدا عن بث الترهيب والرعب في نفوس المواطنين اللبنانيين، وذلك على مرأى من العالم كله دون أن يرفوا لهم جثث. وللأسف عدد الشهداء المدنيين الأبرياء والجرحى في ارتفاع مستمر، فالمئات من المدنيين قد فقدوا حياتهم في غضون أيام قليلة، والمستشفيات أصبحت غير قادرة على استقبال المزيد من الجرحى. لبنان اليوم هو ضحية عدوان إلكتروني سيبراني جوي بحري قد يتحول إلى عدوان بري، بل إلى مسرح لحرب إقليمية واسعة. وآمل أن أعود إلى بلادي متسلحا بموقفكم الصريح الداعي لوقف هذا العدوان واحترام سيادة بلدي وسلامته. ما نشهده اليوم هو تصعيد غير مسبوق مع اللجوء إلى وسائل وآليات جديدة لا سيما إلكترونية لإلحاق الأذى بأدنى إشعاع. إن المعتدي يزعم أنه لا يستهدف إلا المسلحين والسلاح، ولكني أؤكد لكم أن مستشفيات لبنان تعج بالجرحى المدنيين وبينهم العشرات من النساء والأطفال. أمام ذلك يبقى السؤال: من يضمن عدم حصول هكذا اعتداءات على دول أخرى إذا لم تتخذ إجراءات رادعة وعقابية حاسمة بحق المعتدين؟ من يكفل لنا كدولة لبنانية أو أي دولة أخرى سلامة غذائها ومائها وأي مواد أو أي مواد تدخل أراضيها من أي ضرر؟ سيد الرئيس، إن هذه الأحداث لا يمكن فصلها عن تاريخ طويل من النزاعات والانتهاكات التي عانى منها لبنان منذ عقود، وقد شكلت الاعتداءات الإسرائيلية المستمرة على الأراضي اللبنانية انتهاكا صارخا لسيادة الوطنية وحقوقنا كدولة عضو في الأمم المتحدة. إن هذا الوضع ليس جديدا، فلبنان قد مر بفترات طويلة من التوترات والاعتداءات التي كانت تهدد استقراره وسلامة مواطنيه. لكن لبنان يبقى عاصيا على كل التحديات، واللبنانيون واجهوا ويواجهون بشجاعة كل الاعتداءات على كل حبة من تراب الوطن. سيد الرئيس، إنني أتحدث باسم لبنان، ووجودي هنا ليس لتقديم شكوى فقط، ولا لتقديم عرض مفصل عن عدد الشهداء والجرحى والدمار الذي هجر البشر ودمر الحجر، فذلك مثبت للرأي العام العالمي بالصوت والصورة. وإنما وجودي هنا للخروج من هذه الجلسة hoping to come out of this session with a serious solution based on the joint efforts of all the members of the Security Council to put pressure on Israel to achieve an immediate ceasefire on all fronts and to restore stability and security to our region. The Lebanese people reject the war. The Lebanese people believe in stability and work for the future. Lebanon is a founding member state of the United Nations, and it has contributed to drafting the UN Charter. Lebanon also participated in charting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights represented by Dr. Charles Malik. This contribution reflects our strong commitment to human values and to international justice. Today, in the name of these values, which brought us together under the umbrella of the United Nations, we have come to reaffirm the right of Lebanon to stability, security and safety, and its right to sovereignty and defending its sovereignty and its right to recover its occupied territories. The current tensions do not come from a vacuum. They are the result of accumulations of conflicts and aggressions that were never radically settled. Israel never stopped violating the UN resolutions that were adopted throughout the years, particularly Resolution 1701. This resolution was supposed to be a framework to achieve a lasting stability in South Lebanon. Regrettably, we are still witnessing Israeli violations of our sovereignty around the clock by air, sea and land. These repeated violations undermine all the stability efforts and threaten the whole region with an explosion at any moment. Therefore, I reaffirm the commitment of the Lebanese government to with Resolution 1701 adopted in 2006 by your Council. And today, I would like to call upon the Council to act seriously and immediately to guarantee the withdrawal of Israel from all the occupied Lebanese territories and end the violations that are repeated on a daily basis. We also reaffirm the need to end the Israeli aggression against Gaza immediately. The spillovers of what is happening in Gaza is directly affecting the situation in Lebanon and the region, and what is happening will not stop at the borders of the region, but will include the whole Middle East if it is not addressed without further delay. The failure to reach a solution will further complicate the situation. The ongoing violation will only lead to further escalation, which does not serve the interest of any party in this complex formula. Mr. President, the United Nations was created to promote stability. However, we see today that the world is unable to stop the ongoing humanitarian tragedy in our region. Therefore, and on behalf of the Lebanese people, we call upon your Council to shoulder its full responsibilities and take an immediate, decisive stance that would end the plight of our people to pave the way for diplomatic solutions. Mr. President, Lebanon is not asking for charity. We are asking for our legitimate rights pursuant to international law. Our right as Lebanese to live in safety, our right to protect our national sovereignty, and our right to a future away from wars and conflicts. I address your august Council and the international community as a whole, saying that it is time to reject wars and violence and to implement international resolutions so that they do not remain dead letter. We have the tools. What we need today is a true will and effective collaboration. Let us not waste this opportunity. We need to act immediately because we cannot bear to lose another generation because of the war. Thank you, President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Najib Azmi Mikati for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. As Israeli civilians in the north watched with horror while their brothers and sisters in the south were tortured, raped, beheaded, and kidnapped by Hamas terrorists, they fled to bomb shelters as Hezbollah rained down missiles in a show of solidarity, that's how they call it, with these butchers, with these savages. Irit Efrati has lived in Kibbutz Dan in the north since her birth. She has only ever had to flee her home one other time, as a 7-year-old in our War of Independence in 1948. Now, aged 83, she again finds herself as a refugee in the city of Haifa. For nearly a year, Irita struggled to maintain her sanity, confined to a small room and far from the life and home she built over a lifetime. This is not a unique story. Irit joins tens of thousands of Israelis now living in cramped temporary housing, praying for the day she will return to the only place she has ever called home. Since October 8, almost 9,000 rockets, along with hundreds of anti-tank missiles, have been launched at our civilians, targeting their homes, families, and the state. Since October 8, 70,000 civilians have been forced to flee their homes. They have been made refugees within their own country. They do not know when they will be able to return home, restart their lives, or when their children can go back to their schools. Since October 8, terrorists and their relentless attacks have injured more than 370 Israelis and murdered 49, including 12 Israeli Druze children who were playing soccer. And now, I sit here again to defend Israel's actions, as if any other country in our situation would behave differently, would chart any different course, and would not act in the defense of their people. No nation, be honest, no nation would sit idly by as its citizens are attacked. Over the past week, Israel has been conducting precise strikes in Lebanon against Hezbollah's command centers, launching sites, missile and weapon stores, and their leadership. On September 20th, we targeted Hezbollah terrorist leaders during a meeting where they were planning a second October 7th. Hezbollah has made it clear, given the chance, they would storm our borders, infiltrate our communities, murder, rape, and take hostages back to their dens of horror. Yet, the Security Council, the Secretary General, some UN officials, and even UNIFIL commanders can barely bring themselves to mention Hezbollah. Listen to all the statements, like you cannot mention this word. Hezbollah, the internationally designated terrorist organization that began this conflict and acts in constant violation of UN Security Council resolutions. For years, we have been clear. We fully support Resolution 1701, like the Prime Minister just mentioned. We support the resolution, and we support its complete implementation. For years, we have sounded the alarm over Hezbollah's blatant violations. For years, we have provided undeniable evidence of their military buildup, yet our warnings have been ignored. The time for half measures is over. Resolution 1701 must be enforced in full, without delay. And I remind you, it says that the Lebanese army will be on the border with Israel, not Hezbollah. Perhaps some of you have forgotten how this started and why we must defend ourselves, but we have not. And I make this declaration here today to remove any doubt. Never again will the Jewish people hide from the monsters whose purpose in life is to murder Jews. Never again will we provide the benefit of the doubt to those who declare their intention to murder Jews. When they tell us and show us who they are, we will believe them. We will take all necessary steps within our rights and in accordance with international law to neutralize that threat. Israel does not seek a full-scale war. We have made our desire for peace clear to all those who are not blinded by hatred and political agendas. However, Israel is under attack. In the last 24 hours, northern and central Israel have faced a new wave of relentless attacks, with over 150 rockets launched deep into Israeli territory, into areas that are home to 1.5 million Israelis. These strikes have injured civilians and destroyed homes in communities like Tzfat and Rosh Pina. This morning, Hezbollah escalated their aggression, launching a surface-to-surface missile towards Tel Aviv. At the same time, Iran's other proxy, the Islamic resistance in Iraq, one of many in the Middle East, has claimed responsibility for UAV and cruise missile attack on our northern and eastern regions. Yet, many continue to remain silent on Hezbollah's crimes, further emboldening Iran's terror proxies to continue their attacks. They are not discriminating based on race or creed. Nazareth, an important northern Israeli city with a population of 70% Muslim and 30% Christian, the hometown of Jesus himself, was showered with rockets just a few nights ago. Not only does Hezbollah target civilians, but they also continue to hide behind them. Israel has uncovered clear evidence that Hezbollah is using civilian homes as storage and launch sites for their missiles. They are homes where families live. They use the basement, they use the rooftop to put the rockets, and they force people to stay in the houses. These are homes where children sleep. They exploit the very people they claim to represent, putting both Israeli and Lebanese civilians in the line of fire. Worse still, they fire from positions near UNIFIL posts, recklessly endangering peacekeepers from across the world. This is not just a war against Israel. It is a war against humanity, waged by Iran's proxies. They hold the people of Lebanon hostage. We know that. Using their homes as shields for their rockets, pushing the entire region to the brink of destruction. We cannot accept these conditions. We will not let Iran's terrorist proxies dictate how Israelis can live their lives. We will not let our north become a war zone. Mr. President, every representative here knows a rich entity is behind it, orchestrating this situation. It is the regime that has placed a countdown clock in the center of their capital, counting the days until our destruction. I haven't been to Tehran, but if you go there, you will see that clock ticking. The Islamic regime of Iran is the driving force behind the rockets that have been launched at our communities for almost a year, the driving force behind Hezbollah's aggression, and the driving force behind the instability sweeping our region. At the head of the terrorist snake, Iran has spread its venom against innocent Israeli civilians, from the Houthis in Yemen attempting to strangle global trade, to Hezbollah's rocket barrage, from Hamas's practice of rape and kidnapping, to the Shia militias in Syria and Iraq targeting Western personnel. We all know the Ayatollah stands behind it all. Every missile fired by Hezbollah, every drone launched by Iranian proxies, every act of terror on foreign soil traces back to one source, the Islamic regime of Iran. It is the spider at the center of this web of violence, and we have to fight this web of violence. There can be no peace in the region until we dismantle this threat. Esteemed colleagues, there is a clear path of action for this Council if it truly wishes to avoid escalation. Demand the immediate implementation of Resolution 1701. Designate Hezbollah and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization. And finally, stop casting blame on the side defending its citizens. Instead, find the courage to once and for all name and condemn the true aggressor responsible for igniting this cycle of violence. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Israel for their statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency here. Apologies. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Ahmed Al-Bugait, Secretary General of the League of Arab States.
Thank you, Mr. President. السيد الرئيس
Mr. President,
صار واضحا لدينا جميعا اليوم أن ما نخشى منه قد وقع. لقد انتقلت شرارة النار التي أشعلها الاحتلال في غزة إلى لبنان الذي تعرض سكانه خلال يومين لضربات عشوائية غاشمة لم يروا مثيلا لها منذ عقدين. الآن نفهم لماذا رفض الاحتلال الإسرائيلي المقترح تلو المقترح لوقف إطلاق النار في غزة. إسرائيل ببساطة لم تكن ترغب في وقف الحرب وإنما في توسيعها معرضة شعوب المنطقة كلها لوضع بالغ الخطورة ومقامرة بحياة الناس ومستقبل السلام الذي ترسخ مع بعض الدول العربية العقود وضاربة عرض الحائط بكل محاولات وقف هذا الانزلاق المتهور نحو الهوية. كان الطريق واضحا من أجل نزع فتيل التصعيد وقف الحرب الظالمة والغاشمة والدموية على غزة كان كفيلا بتهدئة الأوضاع على الجبهة الشمالية لإسرائيل مع جنوب لبنان وأعطاء الدبلوماسية فرصة لجلب الهدوء. ولكن إسرائيل اختارت توسيع دائرة النار والدم لتعتدي على دولة عربية ذات سيادة يعيش شعبها اليوم في قبة الخوف والترويع. أقول بصراحة أن العجز أمام مواجهة الوحشية في غزة بما فيها عجز هذا المجلس الموقر الذي يجسد الإرادة الدولية هو ما شجع قادة إسرائيل على التصعيد وقد وجدوا الطريق ممهدا ومفروشا بغياب المحاسبة وغياب العقاب بل وغياب أي ضغط حقيقي لتغيير المسار. نحن نعرف كيف تشتعل الحروب لأننا عشنا هذه التجارب الأليمة في الشرق الأوسط لعقود. ما تفعله إسرائيل اليوم هو استدعاء متعمد وأحمق لعاصفة لن يكون أحد بمنأى عن أذاها ومخاطرها. لن يكون أحد بمنأى عن أذاها ومخاطرها. ما تفعله إسرائيل شهدنا مثله كثيرا في التاريخ الحديث للشرق الأوسط وتعلمنا الدروس واستخلصنا العبر. ولكن البعض تصور له غطرسة القوة أنه قادر على تحقيق أهدافه بقتل أكبر عدد ممكن من البشر. البعض يتصور أن السلام لا يتحقق إلا مخضبا بالدماء وأن الدول تعيش بالسيف وحده. إذا ترك هذا الجنون ليسود سنجد أنفسنا أمام سلسلة لا تنتهي من الدم والخراب. إن أمامنا اليوم فرصة حقيقية للتراجع عن الهاوية. الرئيس بايدن President Biden yesterday said in the General Assembly that there is a chance for a diplomatic solution. And I say to this Council that you must shoulder your responsibilities to make this resolution a reality and urgently. This war must stop today. It must stop right now. It must stop in Gaza, in the West Bank, and in Lebanon. We must act now before it is too late. We must act now before it is too late. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Abulgate for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Sayed Abbas Araghchi, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Islamic Republic of Iran.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you, Mr. President, for convening this urgent meeting to address the ongoing Israeli aggression against Lebanon. We welcome the presence of His Excellency Prime Minister Najib Azmi Miqati and express the full solidarity and support of the Iranian people for Lebanon in its heroic defense against the aggression and atrocity of the terrorist entity of Israel. Mr. President, distinguished delegates, the situation in the region is extremely explosive, and if left unchecked, an all-out unprecedented catastrophe would be inevitable. In continuation of its brutality in occupied Palestine, the apartheid occupying regime of Israel is now waging an unjust war of aggression against Lebanon and targeting innocent people across the border and deep inside the territory. This aggression, which has claimed the precious lives and limbs of thousands of innocent people, including women and children, is not just a tragic consequence of an imposed war, it is rather a calculated tactic by Israel to terrorize an entire population and force them out of their homeland. Furthermore, the deliberate and indiscriminate targeting of civilians in Lebanon by detonating pagers, walkie-talkies, and other electronic devices used by rank-and-file citizens across the country must sound the alarm for the entire international community, since this is the most outrageous manifestation of the weaponization of ordinary communication devices. This new version of terrorism must be profoundly condemned by all. Otherwise, it would be established a very dangerous precedent that could be easily replicated by other terrorist groups and entities beside Israel. It is a shame that the Security Council was not allowed by the United States to issue a simple press statement in condemnation of this mass terror. And it has prevented the same Council from doing any meaningful act to stop the genocide in Gaza. Mr. President, the Zionist regime's aggression against Lebanon could not be isolated from the overall situation in the region. For this terrorist regime, international humanitarian law and the principle of human dignity mean nothing. From the long decade of occupation of Palestinian territories to its ongoing genocidal war against people in Gaza, its unprovoked aggression against Syria and Lebanon, and its terrorist attack on Iran's diplomatic mission and assassination of the political leader of Hamas in Tehran, all underscore Israel's real character as a genuine terrorist entity that has no value for peace and human rights. The Israeli regime has no intention of pursuing peace or agreeing to a ceasefire. Its real objective is to drag the entire region into a full-scale war. Unfortunately, the United States and United Kingdom unwavering support to Israel has given a carte blanche to them for all sorts of sinister behavior. The ongoing aggression against Lebanon is fueled by the failure of the international community and in particular by the United Nations Security Council to hold Israel accountable for war crimes and genocide in Gaza. The United States' failure to rein in the regime, coupled with the ongoing supply of military equipment and political backing, has emboldened Israel to commit these heinous acts with impunity. Mr. President, members of the Council, we all need to work together to disallow the normalization of evil and atrocity. The United Nations Security Council should be urged by all states to live up to its responsibility under the United Nations Charter. The criminal and corrupt leadership of the Zionist regime must understand that their actions will not go unanswered. The region stands on the brink of a broader conflict due to regime's aggression and heinous crimes against nations of the region. Now more than ever, Israel has become a serious threat to international peace and security. This regime does not deserve membership in the United Nations. Its representative to the United Nations shamelessly shreds the United Nations Charter before the eyes of the international community. The only way to prevent further escalation is clear. Israel must immediately cease its war on Gaza, and its attacks on Lebanon must stop. Let me be clear, Mr. President. Without the ceasefire in Gaza, there would be no guarantee for peace in the region. The international community cannot afford to remain silent. We call on the Council to respond with urgency and determination. The United Nations Security Council, which bears the legal responsibility for maintaining international peace and security, must shoulder its responsibility and respond decisively to Israel's aggressive and terrorist actions in Lebanon. If this doesn't happen, the region risks being dragged into a full-scale conflict. The Israeli regime supporters and enablers, especially the United States and the United Kingdom, have a legal and moral responsibility to act before it's absolutely late. The atrocity, crimes, and genocide committed by the occupying apartheid regime must not go unpunished, as impunity has been emboldening the regime to persist in its patterns of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. The world is watching, and history will judge this Council by the actions it takes or fails to take today. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Aranchi for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Badr Ahmed Mohamed Abdelati, Minister for Foreign Affairs, Immigration and Egyptian Expatriates of Egypt.
شكرا سيادة الرئيس السيدات والسادة.
Thank you, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen. What we are witnessing in Lebanon today is a full-blown aggression and a blatant violation of the sovereignty of a country that is a founding member of the United Nations. It is an aggression that has killed hundreds and injured thousands and caused the forced displacement of tens of thousands of Lebanese citizens. This has been done with complete disregard to the Charter of the United Nations and in violation of international law and international humanitarian law. The tragedy that Lebanon is experiencing today and which we are meeting today to end did not happen in a vacuum. It is the inevitable result of the shameful inability of the Security Council to fulfill its responsibilities to put an end to the war that has been raging for a whole year in Gaza. We in Egypt have repeatedly warned that the continuation of the war in the Gaza Strip will lead to its spilling over to other regional areas, and it would threaten international peace and security throughout the entire Middle East. And we say it very clearly and honestly. What we have been witnessing over the past year in Gaza and what we are witnessing now in Lebanon is likely to expand to other areas in the region if the international community does not shoulder its responsibility to put an end to the machine of death and destruction. And partial solutions and palliative policies will not do. It is no longer acceptable to move ahead without the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 1701. It must be fully implemented with no selection and with no discrimination between the different parties addressed in the resolution. There must be an immediate and unconditional halt to the continued violation of the sovereignty of Lebanese territories and airspace. However, the return of complete stability to the Middle East is primarily dependent on the full and immediate implementation of Security Council Resolution 2735 and putting an end to the war of aggression on the Gaza Strip. This is the fundamental conflict that has caused all the other tensions that we are currently witnessing in the entire region. And without putting a stop to this bloodbath that has been ongoing in Gaza for the past year, we will continue to use palliative care, and temporary truces that collapse very quickly in the Middle East is at a very sensitive crossroad and before a very real threat. We either fully stop all forms of aggression and hostilities in all arenas, or we face more collapse and a rapid expansion of the circle of conflict in a region that can no longer tolerate more destruction. This is our responsibility, and I hope that the Security Council meeting today will be able to rise to the level of this responsibility so that we can put an end to this unjustifiable and unacceptable catastrophe that Lebanon is living. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Abdelati for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Bassam Sabag, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Expatriates of the Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. سيدات والسادة، لقد عقد مجلس الأمن قبل أيام معدودة جلسة طارئة للتعامل مع الهجوم الإرهابي السكاني الإسرائيلي على اللبنانيين
discuss the terrorist Israeli cyber attack against the Lebanese people, which claimed the lives of dozens of civilians. Thousands of others were wounded. These were very serious injuries. The occupying entity had transformed civilian devices into tools of collective massacre. The absence of action, the lack of action on the part of the Security Council to dissuade Israel emboldened it in continuing to escalate its aggression against the fraternal people of Lebanon. For the past few days, Israel has been continuing to brutally and violently perpetrate bombardment, which spares neither places, nor people, nor homes, nor hospitals. And this has resulted in hundreds of civilians becoming martyrs. More than 500 people lost their lives in a single day. These include women, children, journalists, and humanitarian workers. And this is in addition to the mass displacement of people. The Israeli aggression against Lebanon, a fraternal country, highlights the contempt of the Israeli entity for the Charter of the United Nations and international law, and its obstinate intention to expand the crime of genocide it is perpetrating against the Palestinian people to ensure that it also encompasses Lebanese territory. More than 42,000 innocent Palestinians are already dead, and more than 100,000 have been wounded, as if this is not enough to quench the thirst of Israeli criminals as they're bent on destruction, death, chaos. The Syrian Arab Republic condemns in the strongest terms the Israeli aggression, the brutal, heinous aggression against the fraternal Lebanese people. We extend our full solidarity with the Lebanese people. We stand fully ready to deliver all necessary assistance to our Lebanese brethren in all areas and at all levels. Syria stresses that the Security Council needs to act immediately, urgently, now, not tomorrow, to condemn the Israeli multifaceted, multi-pronged aggression, to bring it to an end, to prevent Israel from unleashing a full-blown war in the region through the expansion of its aggression. We and other countries warned against this on multiple occasions. We warned against the possibility of grave repercussions for peace and security, both in the Middle East and throughout the world.
إن الحرب العدوانية الإسرائيلية على الشعب
Mr. President, the
الفلسطيني
Israeli war
التي
of
قاربت على
aggression
العام
against the Palestinian
قد
people
ترافقت أيضا مع
has lasted for
اعتداءات
nearly 1 year
ممنهجة
now, and
ومتكررة
this has been
على
accompanied
سوريا
by systematic,
حيث استهدفت
recurrent
قوات الاحتلال
attacks
الإسرائيلي
targeting
بالصواريخ
Syria.
مناطق عديدة في
The
سوريا
Israeli occupying force
أدت لارتقاء العديد من
has
الضحايا المدنيين
carried
وجرح
out strikes
الكثير
against
غيرهم
many areas in Syria, which
وإيقاع
resulted
أضرار
in several
في البنى
civilians becoming
التحتية
martyrs. Many
والمنشآت
have been
الحيوية
wounded,
المدنية
and this has
والأبنية
also triggered
السكنية
damage to
لا
infrastructure
بل
and
وحتى
critical
استهدفت
infrastructure, as well as
المقرات
civilians,
الدبلوماسية.
and residential buildings and even
لقد
diplomatic
طالبت سوريا
premises
إلى
have been
جانب
damaged.
غالبية الدول الأعضاء في الأمم المتحدة
Syria,
بوضع
like
حد
most
لذلك
member
العدوان
states of the United
ووقف
Nations,
هذه الانتهاكات المستمرة لسيادة
called for
الأراضي
an end to be
السورية
brought to this aggression,
بما في
for an
ذلك
end to be brought
استمرار
to
احتلالها
these
للجولان
violations,
العربي السوري منذ
these
العام
ongoing violations
1967
against Syrian sovereignty, including the
إن
occupation of the
الجمهورية
Syrian
العربية
Arab
السورية
Golan, which has been
تعتبر
ongoing since
استمرار كيان الاحتلال
1967.
الإسرائيلي
The Syrian Arab
في
Republic
عدوانه الهمجي
is of the
والوحشي
view
على
that
الفلسطينيين وعلى
the
السوريين
ongoing
وعلى
brutal
اللبنانيين
aggression
ما
is
كان
the barbaric
ليحدث
aggression by the Israeli
لولا
entity
الدعم
against the
اللامحدود
Palestinian, Syrian,
والمتعدد
Lebanese
الأوجه
people
الذي تقدمه
could not have
الولايات
taken
المتحدة
place
الأمريكية لهذا
without the
الكيان
boundless,
بما في
unlimited
ذلك
support
الإفلات
delivered
من
by the
العقاب
United States to that entity,
مما يجعلها
including
شريكا
in terms of impunity,
في
which
هذا
makes the
العدوان.
United States complicit in this aggression.
تطالب الجمهورية العربية السورية مجلس
The
الأمن
Syrian Arab Republic
بإنهاء حالة الشلل
calls
التي يعيشها
upon the Security Council
والتحرك
to
الفوري
end
لوضع
its
قرارات ذات
paralysis,
الصلة
to
في
act
الصراع العربي الإسرائيلي
immediately,
وفي مقدمتها
to
القرارات
implement the
242
resolutions of the Security Council related to the Syrian to the conflict, specifically to Resolution 242, 338, and 497.
لن تنعم بالسلام
We
والاستقرار
reaffirm the
ما
fact
لم
that the
يتم
region can only achieve
الاحتلال
peace and
الإسرائيلي
stability
لجميع
if
الأراضي العربية المحتلة
there is an end
في
brought to the
فلسطين
Israeli occupation of
وسوريا
of
ولبنان.
all occupied Arab lands in
شكراً
Palestine,
سيد
Syria, and Lebanon. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Sabak for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Joseph Borrell Fontelles, High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and Vice President of the European Commission.
Le Président, nous parlons d'une région au monde.
We are talking about a region in the
Nous parlons d'une
world
région au monde où les pires généralement
where the
certains.
worst is generally
Where the worst is generally right.
certain,
So
clear.
I would first and foremost to express my deepest sympathy for the Lebanese people who have clearly for a long time been hostage from a conflict that they don't deserve and which is far beyond them. We all know the tragic situation on recent months. You have been explaining it, I will not repeat it. 60,000 Israeli inhabitants forced to leave their homes since October. Now 200,000 Lebanese on the roads, forced to flee the fighting, while their houses are being systematically destroyed. They will not have anywhere to come back. I'm not going to play the game of blaming one more than the other, but what I know is three things. First, escalation won't solve anything because war doesn't solve anything. Second, what's happening in southern Lebanon cannot be separated from what is happening in Gaza. One thing influences the other. But at the same time, we have to do everything to avoid that southern Lebanon become a new Gaza. And it's becoming a new Gaza. As Secretary General said at UNGA, and as many of you have said, when the communication devices were exploding targeted on its purpose, but indiscriminated on their consequences, they have put the Lebanese people in the night under terror. The third is that there is a legal basis for settling the Israeli-Lebanese conflict, and this basis, you know, is this famous resolution 1701. The little problem is that it has been approved more than 20 years ago, without being implemented. So what we can do in the face of the escalation, in the face of this procession of death stretches under the door, and while the cannon sound is behind us. I heard Le Canon when I was visiting the UNICEF headquarters some days ago. And I am asking this question to the Security Council. And allow me, and excuse me, but sometimes I wonder if it is not better the Council to talk about insecurity, who register cries, recriminations, and grievances without solving them, and when they agree on something, not being able to implement it. What a tragedy. So now it's up to all of us to do something for a ceasefire along the blue line, so the instinct for life can take precedence over the instinct for death, so that the terrible fatalism that is ours today in the face of so much horror can be overcome. Before coming here, I had the opportunity to speak with the families of Israeli hostages held by Hamas, still almost 1 year. So I know how this tragic situation is affecting everyone, Palestinians, Israelis, and now Lebanese. And I saw some days ago in the Rafah border, by the way, closed. Once again, listening the canyon, how the tragic situation in Gaza called our conscience. So please, let's try to call unanimously for the suspension of hostilities along the blue line and the implementation of this famous resolution 1701. What else can we do? At least let's agree on that and try to make it implemented. Let's call for restraint to avoid the trap of fatality, the one that would have us believe that there is nothing to be done. Yes, something has to be done. That's the only thing I can do. But naming things is essential. You have to put a name to the things, because refusing to name things only adds to the world's tragedy. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Borrell Fonteles for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.